Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everybody. August 22nd, 2018, as we celebrate the queenship of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She is crowned queen of heaven and earth, all that God created in the universe. 1 week after we celebrated her Assumption, August 15th, last week. And I hope you were able to listen to the show last week on that devotion and how we came to that and some of the stories. And I'd like to give a personal witness here of something I witnessed back in 1996 at in Portugal, where and it was covered by EWTN. Several continents were going to honor the Blessed Virgin Mary with a beautiful crown, a structure of cement, where it would rest on this pedestal, and it would be covered at the same time. In this particular case, it was 6:30 p.m. in Portugal, and they got these continents. I believe there were 5 that were going to do this all at the same time. As I say, it was going to be televised by EWTN. So I was there at the time with my future wife, and our group was invited with John Haffert to attend this. And they had this in Orem, Portugal, where you've heard me mention this is an important town, where Saint Nuno delivered them from the Moors, the Muslims, in a major battle at this hill of Orem, where there was a castle, where they were vastly outnumbered, but won Portugal's freedom over the Moors, and he became a monk and left all his riches, wealth, and fame to become a monk and turn his life over to Jesus. So it was a very special day. It was so special that, the Bishop of Portugal and the King were going to come to witness this. So it was very, very, very important. And as I said, it was going to start at 6:30. But prior to his coming up to Orem, the buses, that it was a very nasty sky, and you could tell it was just going to open up and pour and probably have thunder and lightning. It was just really gray, really bleak, and it was a shame because so many people were coming to witness this. And as I mentioned, the bishop was coming himself of Portugal. King was a big thing. And as we got there and the ceremony started, the sky actually separated, and the sun came up out of the sky, out of the clouds and this dark sky, and started to ascend. And that dark sky was replaced by beautiful sunshine and beautiful white puffy clouds. And in front of the sun was a disk, and it started shooting out all colors, reds and greens and just golds, and it was shimmering and shaking in the sky. And the sun came toward us, and then it went back, and it lasted the entire, I will say, 25 minutes of the ceremony. The entire time the ceremony took place, the second, literally, that the ceremony ended and the applause ended, the sun, with that disk in front of it still shimmering, descended back into the gray, stormy clouds. And it was just unbelievable. One young lady wrote about it later that she saw a rainbow bridge from the sun to the crown, and the Virgin Mary walked down on the bridge, take her crown, and go back up. And leaving that night, after a celebration, when we were getting closer to Fatima, you could look back at the town of Orem and see a red U, a glow over the entire little town. It was just awesome. And I remember John Hafford, he's passed away now, who did so much to spread the cause of the Blue Army in Fatima. He had such a calmness and peace about him and such a smile, and he said, something from Scripture that you're probably well aware of, that, Lord, now you can take your servant, for he has seen, as Simeon said, he has waited to see the Messiah. Well, John was ready because he had saw such a miraculous experience that night. And then watching that glow over Orem as we were going back to Fatima was just, you can take your servant now. he knows. So it was just an awesome experience on that 1996, August 22nd, the Queenship of Mary, that they had celebrated. And I personally witnessed this. I was one of the ones that saw a sun come toward us and then go back in the sky. So, if you're familiar with the October 13th, 1917 miracle of Fatima that the Virgin Mary had promised Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco, that was part of what had happened. The sun appeared to hurl toward the earth and then went back and continued to zigzag and then take its place in the sky that we're familiar with. So an awesome experience. That was one of the many I had at Fatima and in Portugal. So I was really blessed to be part of that. So I just wanted to start to show off by sharing that with you, that was so special. And on to our topic, because I'm sure you're well aware of the newspaper articles and the grand jury findings in Pennsylvania with the scandal of the abuse, which is causing, a great deal of sadness, great deal of concern, anger, a lot of things if you're a Catholic when you're reading these things in these reports. And, it's horrific. I mean, what can you say? Anytime you see these types of things, it's just brutal. And it's very disturbing. And I think many would agree that, with the wheat comes the weeds. And that has to be separated out. Jesus talked about this in Scripture. You're going to pull up some of the good with the weeds if you take them out. So they have to grow side by side and together. And certainly on the show tonight, we're not going to make any excuses for this horrific and I believe aberrant behavior that were these cases of abuse, many of them in the 70s and 80s took place. And certainly our hearts go out to any victims. And it's just so sad, so tragic, because it put a pall and over all the priests that do such good. And believe me on this, I think many Catholics know, and if you do the research and you check this out, you'll find this is a small percentage of priests. Certainly what makes it bad is that there was a cover-up, and rather than to avoid scandal and fess up and admit horrific things and face up to it and see where we go from there, the cover-up made things only worse. And it's not a good thing. But as I mentioned, it's casting a pall over all those beautiful priests that do such selfless work. And that's the majority of priests. And I think those in our local parishes, we see this. You know your particular priest, and if they're if they're holy, if they're consecrated to Mary, if they're following Mary, good things happen. Good things happen, and certainly this is what we want to focus on. But we've also got to realize and deal with what has transpired, so this does not happen again. Because again, this can cause people, if people are not strong in the faith, or some are considering converting. It certainly could change them coming into the church or leaving the church, what have you. So it's very bad. But again, the church has been through many, many, many things. At one time, the barbarians were at the gates. And think of that. Think of that, what would have happened if Attila at that time was not turned back by Pope Leo. And an interesting legend to that, and we deal with the mysticism here, and we'll get into this later in the show. One of the problems that we have is a lack of that. This is my opinion. There's a lack of that today in the church, is in dealing with the supernatural and the mystical. But legend has it, and remember, in so-called these legends and myths, there's always elements of truth, always. And the legend has it that Attila's right-hand man, once they rode away, after Leo persuaded him not to destroy Rome, his right-hand man asked him, Attila, I've rode with you and fought with you for many, many, many years, and I've never known you to turn or fear anything. Why did not we proceed into Rome? And Attila had told him, that was my plan. But every time I advanced on this pope, I saw a gigantic man standing next to him, and he pulled a sword each time I advanced, and I knew that I could not beat him. So this is one thing the church survived. The church survived, and we've got to kind of put ourselves in the place of those people in that 3rd century demonic plague. Now, we really need to think about this. Men, women, children. The plague it had no discrimination. Many priests, many religious nuns serving to try and help those people dying. A tremendously horrible death. Horrible, painful way to go. And many of the people at that time questioned, where is God in all this? Is there a God? What do we really believe? Even those who serve him, these priests, these religious, they're susceptible to the plague, and they're dying. And then when we look, we see 1/3 of the population of Europe wiped out. Now think if we lived at that time, how we would have felt about seeing family members, friends, the priests, the religious, in being carted away to be burned so the plague would not spread, covered with these blotches and these boils of this horrible, horrible disease, and to die such a painful death. And that the church did survive that. The church is responsible for the saving of Western civilization as we know it today, with the literature and the arts and everything. Because we must remember, there was a period of time known as the Dark Ages. We touched on this in the other shows, that it truly was. There was no progress. There was no literature. There was no art. There was nothing. And without the church taking, and those monasteries that were built up, and were able to copy some of the Greek and Roman literature, and some of these things, if they had disappeared, where would we be today? In the sciences and the arts and what we know. So the church survived that. And it survived the Reformation. It survived many things. And it will survive this, because Christ has made a promise that the gates of hell will not prevail. So we can take confidence in that. And I want to say that, as they say, the old saying is, you can take that to the bank. Does it mean we're going to have problems? Sure. One of the things we deal with in the show with the mysticism is that it brings hope, and prayerfully and hopefully brings people closer to the faith, to realize that there is a supernatural, and that there is a place we will not die. We will not be annihilated. We will survive eternity, and an eternity either in hell or heaven. And when we look at all the things happening now, whether it's in the church or society, and people throw up their arms, and why is this and why is that? But if, really strip it down to what this life is really about, a journey to God, and where we spend our eternity, and the battle between good and evil, then it makes perfect sense, because the devil is not still. Pope Leo the 13th, way back, and this is how we got the St. Michael prayer, had a vision where he saw Satan asking God that he could break the church in a period of time, and he would like to be granted that time, and God gave it to him. And it was the smoke that had entered the church, as they say, and it was a 100-year period, which now we can see is ending. And St. Leo proposed the St. Michael prayer, and he knew the dangers, what would happen here. And, one of the things is the St. Michael prayer after Mass is abandoned. Some parishes, I guess, still do it. I know they do it at EWTN down there in Huntsville. But, these are some of the things we'll touch on later. But, he saw that smoke entering. And we don't have to look too much to see just how bloody and how much carnage was in the 20th century with World War I and World War II and the Chairman Mao and London and the Russian Revolution. It's just staggering, the amount of abortions. It's just incredible. Now we reached into states and countries with the euthanasia. So there certainly is a battle going on here, and we've got to be aware of that. That's number one. And that's where I think we've gotten into some of the problems here. Again, it's all personal opinion. And that we tend now, if you look, that in some areas the church has evolved into like a business, like a corporation. And the priests, in all fairness to them, and I'm not just talking ones that are involved in scandal, we'll talk about that later, but I'm talking about generally here, the priests, they have so much responsibilities and are asked so much, especially the young priests. Think about it. At one time, they were, in a lack of a better word, apprenticed out when they were living with some of the older priests that ran some of the parishes. So they could get that experience, which is so vital as they aged and took the place of some of the older pastors. Well, that's not true anymore. They go right into the thick of things, and so much is demanded of them, where it's quite easy, where they're doing so much. And I mentioned, especially if it's like we're looking at this a business-type orientation of the church, where they don't have time for prayer, and they're not really doing the spiritual things for themselves and for their parishioners. And that's going to get you into trouble, because the church isn't a business and shouldn't be run as a business. Some of the people that are older than I am, and remember Vatican II, and Vatican II gets a lot of bad knock against it. And that's unfortunate, because if you read some of the documents, Vatican II had some, initiated by Pope John the 23rd, had some wonderful things. But it was that so-called spirit of Vatican II where some of the bishops, especially in Germany, and some of the more liberal-minded, took it upon themselves to say, well, we can get rid of statues of Mary, St. Joseph. We don't need to have that anymore. Let's take a little bit of the sacredness out here. We can get rid of these altar rails. We can have communion in hand, and things that people take for granted now, that people think, rather, the church in Rome okayed and solidified, and that these changes were authorized, were not really authorized by Rome, but by local dioceses. And we ran into trouble there, because there was the church began to change a little bit, where it got more concerned with the social aspect of this planet. And there's nothing wrong with the social aspect of the planet. Jesus talks about Matthew 25, about feeding those who are hungry, clothing those who are naked, visiting those in prison. In essence, not only loving God, but your fellow man as you love God, as you love yourself. But, and you can see this with the liberation theology, it went askew, where that became a priority rather than the supernatural nature of our soul and the destiny of that soul. And that is the church's number one job, is the salvation of souls. And that's why I say it cannot be run like a business, because that saving of the supernatural soul is paramount to what the church does. Yes, it helps bring about the kingdom of God and to help and initiate social programs and outreach to help those brothers and sisters. But the primary goal should be the salvation of souls, because no matter what systems we enact, no matter how much we try to bring about the kingdom of God here on the planet, we're going to die. And until Judgment Day, when Christ restores everything and a new heaven and a new earth are created, people will die. And despite the systems, those systems, because they're initiated by man, can be fallible, and they can be changed, and they can be molded to what a particular belief system or change in that belief system initiate. And that's where you run into trouble, because you can get away from dogma and doctrine and the truth that Jesus set down in the church that he founded, and you have problems, as we're seeing. So that's one thing, because when we look back, we're going to see what I believe was called the synthesis of all the heresies that we see. And that, I didn't come up with that, but the man we celebrated just a couple of days ago, Pope Pius X, did. He called it the synthesis of all heresies. What did he mean by that? And what was that? That was modernism. And what is that? Let's touch on that, because of many of the things that are happening now and have happened in the church are this era, this heresy of modernism. And, we touch on a few things of it, because you can discuss this a long time. But basically, God cannot be known and proved to exist by natural reason. And external signs of revelation, such as miracles and prophecy, don't prove the divine origin of the Christian religion and are not suited to the intellect of modern man. We're much smarter than modern man today. We're well beyond any type of miracles and prophecies and revelation, especially if they're in Scripture. And that, of course, leads to Christ not finding the church, or founding a church. And that the essential structure then, since Christ didn't find it, can change. And that means the church's dogmas can continuously evolve over time so that they can change, and this is critical, from meaning one thing to meaning another thing. And faith is just a blind religious feeling that wells up from the subconscious under the impulse of a heart and a will that's trained to morality. But it's not a real assent of the intellect to divine truth learned by hearing it from an external source, like the church Jesus founded, or Scripture, or anything. Okay? So you can see that this reeks of a lot of liberalism. And it's got smacks of evolutionary theory of Darwin and liberal political movements, you can see. Especially when you look at the center of the modernism and you look at this Enlightenment of France, England, Italy, and Germany. And those eras of modernism that Pope Pius X warned against and battled against, and make no mistake, he battled against it big time, are still here today in the church. And you see this. Now, we'll discuss this a little later, but so we see this modernism creeping into the church, and we see a liberalism creeping into the church, because modernism is going to set itself up against traditionalists who want to stay with what the church was and what they were used to and the traditions that held. Now, that's an important part. But the essential part is that Christ's teachings cannot change, because he did find a church, contrary to what the modernist era says. And that, through apostolic succession, through that lineage from Peter to Pope Francis right now of popes, is the Catholic Church. And it does stand for truth. So when you see these truths being juxtaposed and changed, you've got some trouble or bent to society, because that's a danger of modernism, and a danger that the church finds itself in now, is that what some of the Protestant churches, I'm not picking on them, but I just want to make a point, have done, which is they've changed to what the secular beliefs of the time are. And that is an extremely dangerous position to get in, because there is much confusion in that. There is much confusion. Is marriage between a man and a woman? I don't know. Is the Eucharist really God, or is it just a symbol? Not sure. What about the sacraments? Did Christ really initiate these? Maybe not. What about the Bible? I don't know. Maybe there is a lot of myths in there. Maybe we can't really believe anything in that. And you can see, and I'm certainly being facetious, but you can see, if you're not strong in the faith, how that can lead to a great deal of damage. What you have is a watered-down faith that's dictated not in truth, but in the changing times of the society and those that are in power at that time. So this would always be not an objective truth, which does not change, making it a true truth, an objective truth, but a subjective truth, depending on the whims of the time, the emotion of the time. Especially today, we live in a very emotional time, a very touchy-feely, sensitive time, where your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. There is no truth. It's all relative. And of course, Pope Benedict warned of that moral relativism, and we are seeing it aces in spades, and the damage it does, because there is objective truth. There is time-honored truth. And it's when we get away from those truths, when we stray from them, and that includes the church, we get into trouble. Lots of it, as we're seeing now. Because when you break away from the dogma and the doctrine of what Christ taught and what he exemplified, we bring it down a notch to man. And what we teach is not necessarily always the truth. And what we teach may not necessarily always be good for our fellow man. And what we teach may not necessarily be for love of God or bring us closer to God. And in all that confusion, what's behind that? And we look no further than Satan. Because he is the father of all this division, and certainly this confusion. For he is not one to sow unity, but division and confusion, where Christ is unified, and so is that, and is one of peace and clarity and truth. And that's what we need to focus on. There's a great deal of confusion, not only certainly in the church today, but also in our society. And words always being important. You have now media forces and groups and people using certain words for an agenda to soften things on what they really are, such as rather than when you're destroying and killing children in the womb, it's a choice. It becomes a choice. And that marriage isn't really between a man and a woman, which then through procreation equals a child, but for actually anything we want to redefine it to be. And that the sacred time at the end of one's life is not sacred at all, but possibly a drain on economic source for society. And my gosh, their usefulness is used up, so why not cut it short? Make it cost effective. I believe Chelsea Clinton just last week had said something about that being good for the economy, abortion was. You know, it's pretty scary talk. And words are very, very, very strong. They affect us. They don't get enough respect for what they can can lead to in a good way, or just the opposite, in a destructive way. And, you know, one of the things that the media in portraying, and we must be, you know, we got to be very aware here of how the media portrays its stories in the society we live in today on the Catholic Church. Because years ago, it was portrayed as something good, especially in Hollywood and the newspapers. But now it's not anymore. And they can hardly wait to come up with a scandal story, or a priest that falls, or this or that, or something Pope Francis says out of context. Whatever it is, they jump on it because they have an agenda. So we've got to be careful. And they have the power of words. They know what power that is. You know, give an example. One thing with the scandal that the media uses, the big word, is pedophilia. Now, I'm no expert and don't even claim to be anything on that, but I believe that is like for children 5 and under to be classified that. And I certainly could be wrong, and if I'm wrong on that, you know, my apologies. But my point is that that's the word they throw around. When most of the abuse we see, and again, I am not saying this is justified in any way, shape, or form, and we'll talk about this later in the show. But most of the abuse, it looks like, from the statistics coming in, are prepubescent girls and boys. So the word, rather, should be ephobophilia, rather than pedophilia. But we don't see that. Again, you know, when you eliminate or lead words with a certain agenda, this is what they're trying to do. And this is my opinion, because we need to call this for what it is. There are many, 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 many of these acts that are homosexual. And that is a word we're not hearing. And that's not a good thing. Because this is what I meant about confusion. The Catholic Church does not hate homosexuals. And yet media outlets, that's where they want to steer the conversation to. And that's why they want to take it down a notch or two when you see these scandals. But they won't use that word. We go back to the pedophilia. Because that's something I think we can all agree on that is horrific, that these poor kids would undergo this. And they know that. And that's what they want to play on. But they don't want to talk about the homosexual incidents in the church because there's a big push that homosexuality is not what the Bible said. And this is what I mean about confusion. That marriage is whatever you want it to be. 2 men, 2 women, what have you. And in some cases, when we see scripture verses being changed or taken out, so we don't hear about the condemnation of homosexuality. And we're not going to touch it because there are many people in power that are of this persuasion. So we don't hear about that and the damage it's done to the church, and that it has. So we kind of cover that up in the media. We're not going to talk about that because the agenda, I believe, is now we've got to make this completely acceptable behavior. And that's where the confusion goes in. Because it's the old adage, well, people will say, if it's true love, it can't be wrong. And, it sounds so good. That sounds so good. But it's not true. Because you can say that about a man and a woman committing adultery. And if true love is never wrong, what happens to those two committing adultery, to their spouses and their children and their families and their relatives? It isn't a Hollywood movie where it's attractive adultery, but the reality in real life is carnage and destruction. Trust me, when I was teaching karate, I saw the damage divorce did to children in real life, not in any movie. And it was sad, very sad. So here's a case where if it's love, it can never be wrong. It's absurd. Absurd. And it's a bad argument because it's one of confusion again. And we've got lots of confusion, and we've got to straighten it out. So what we need to do as a church now, what we need to do as Catholic Christians, is we need to pray for our priests. And we need, if you fast, outstanding. If you're undergoing crosses, whatever they be, large, small, offer them up for our priests in our church. We need to demand truth and transparency. And I think that's coming. And some are arguing, and this is where the confusion goes in. I mentioned the homosexual acts that were involved in some of the abuse, and you see St. Francis and you see others. They want, and it's a strong word, but it is the word that needs to be done, purged. That anyone entering the seminary with even the slightest tendencies, they have to go. They cannot be allowed. And those that have the tendency, they have to go. A purging is what they want. And the church needs it. And it sounds hard, and it sounds rough. But the church is strong. It's been strong for 2,000 years. It's had to deal with incredible, if you read the history, incredible obstacles and opposition and will till the last day. Because, again, it is supernatural. It's Satan and it's God. So that's one thing that's happening. But in the confusion, I've seen others, some involved with the church, say, well, we got enough shortage of priests. We can't afford that. And we can't really make that jump. Well, yeah, you gotta. Because the damage that's being done is dramatic. And you've got to protect these kids. And you've got to protect these people. And you've got to be the pastors that God called you to be. And that's going to make a lot of hard choices, and that's one of them. And that's going to cause a lot of controversy, but we have to stand up to that controversy. We cannot bend to the emotion of the particular time we live in and what the secular world wants. Because what they really want is to destroy the church. That's what they want, by any way, means, shape, or form. Remember, there are those that believe that any means justify that end. That's scary. But again, let's look at this from the supernatural. It makes complete sense. So there's some call now for lay people to look at and not really trust the bishops anymore to sort of police themselves. And maybe an outside entity is what we need. And maybe that will help. But, again, in my opinion, and I don't know because I don't have any inside track to rates, and I certainly don't have the right, And it looks, though, it's my opinion, that God is stripping away a lot of the veils and a lot of things that were covered up, whether it be in the political realm or whether it be with the church. And if he's doing that, you're going to see a lot of good come out of this. Because remember, no matter how bad things get for society or church, God somehow, even in our lives, our own particular lives, God will get good out of the worst tragedies imaginable. And how do we know that? Because of Good Friday. The worst thing that mankind ever did was to kill his God. And yet God turned that into the greatest thing for mankind through the resurrection. So we can trust in that. You know, before he became Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger was asked, and it was prophetic, where do you think the church is going? And he said, well, you know, it may be smaller, but it's going to be stronger, and it's going to be holier. And we see this happening because, you know, I'll say this because toward the end of the show, I'll get back to that, but to see how prophetic this has become. Certainly we can see that in the prophecy, the way things are going now, with a lack of faith and the loss of faith in Europe and the States and with the youth. We hear it all the time, and the lack of priests and the lack of religious. But the other call we've got to watch now as a church is to change our doctrines, our truths, to bend now because there's been a scandal, and to sort of take the heat off because we need to come down a notch or two from our high horse. Well, first of all, the church needs to do, and so do you and I as Christians, penance for what transpired here. We need to do that. We need to have that penance. And yet, we need to stay true to dogmas and truth to the faith that Jesus gave us. Because, again, what we're seeing here with this bending to society is a very dangerous place for us to go, because we don't want to bend where we lose our dogmas and our doctrines. I'll give you a good example I'm hearing now. And we got to be very careful with this one. Because, again, some of these things seem so good on the outside, but when you start to strip away the words or not, that's the of our priests. That this wouldn't happen if we allowed married priests. And that is some kind of rhetoric that has really been around for a bit, and even more so in becoming more of a hotbed issue now and topic. Now, this isn't an issue of celibacy, okay? Let's look at the truth of this. This is an issue of chastity and not living that chaste life. This has nothing to do with celibacy. This has to do with a lack of chastity. And that means whether priests are, living double lives, cheating on their vocation, either men in a homosexual act or with women in an act of adultery. Because that call to chastity is what's being broken. And that's what we have to have. So when you're given that skill, that is absolutely not true. There is chastity in marriage, right? Because you can't, as a married couple, just give in to your whims and do whatever you want, with whatever you want, who you ever wish to have as partners. You can't. There's chastity in marriage. And if there's chastity in marriage, there's chastity in priesthood. And that's critical. So that's what we're not hearing about. We're supposed to be a chaste society, and that's almost laughable today. Not almost. Actually, it is laughable. When you look at the amount of pornography, whether it's internet, and we did one show on that about the young boys and girls that have had a pornographic experience before the ages of 8 and 9. That's absurd. That's child abuse. We don't look at child abuse, in ways where we exploit these children in the media, in music, in the lyrics, on television, and in the movies. With the destruction that divorce brings, there's much child abuse here. And it's all bad. It's all bad. But you're going to find that these people that commit these type of acts, marriage, if they have a tendency for this aberrant behavior, isn't going to change that. Isn't going to change that. So the celibacy issue is not an issue of that. It's chastity. And society doesn't want that. And that's one of the reasons they want all this money. Remember the old saying, misery loves company. So chastity is the key, not celibacy. So we must be very careful as Catholics if we're going to start demanding that the church change its teaching on this particular dogma or any of them. Because once that chink in the armor is broken, you're going to see all kinds of things gush in there, because the father of all this is the devil, and he seeds those seeds of confusion and division and disruption and deception. We need to pray against that. And to those folks, those dear children of God that are on a fence right now and looking at the church and saying, that's why I don't go. That's why I'm not going to go. They're no good. Say one thing, do another. Yeah, they're nothing. They're not holy. And it's an excuse for them. But is it really? Let's look at this a little bit. We know what Jesus started is unblemished, his church. It is holy. It is Catholic. It's apostolic, and it's one. And it's without blemish. The church he started. But the church is also made up of sinners. And we've got to realize that. And sinners, we are weak. We try to do the best we can, but many, many times, we fail. And thank God, as a Catholic, we have the sacrament of reconciliation. And when we do our penance. If we use that type of thinking, I would challenge those folks that use this, then you better not go to your doctor or seek medical help, because there's scandals there. Why? We're sinners. And don't attend a college university or send your children to public school or any school for that matter. Because at the last study, there were 3 to 1 times more abuse in the school system, which does not get the media coverage as much as the abuse system in the church does. 3 to 1. So don't send them to school. Why? Well, they're sinners. And I guess you better stop doing any type of banking or financial investments, because Wall Street and the banks are rife with corruption because they're sinners. And a matter of fact, the corporations and the grocery stores and the farmers, I guess you better stop eating, because some of the food that we buy and it's grown, they're sinners. And then last, I guess you better chuck your family and throw out the baby and the bathwater, because there are sinners in our family and members of our family who we love dearly that have not done really good things in life. So I guess we better cancel them out too and walk away from them. Now, we're not going to do these things, are we? And we shouldn't turn our back on the church because of a very few, that have done very, very, very bad things. But to concentrate on those who are selfless, those priests, those bishops that stand true to Jesus' teachings, to the doctrines and dogmas of the church, that stand up for the truth, that lead that life of chastity, that are self-serving, that have a strong prayer life, that know the value of confession, that even when they're exhausted and tired and that call comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning, boom, they're gone. I saw that with priests. I've been associating work through my parish activities and my studies with many priests. And I must tell you that they are so dedicated, so awesome. They are great, great, great. And it's important that we realize that. And that's what we want to look at. We want to focus on that good. And, you know, I had the pleasure of going to a graduation party for college graduates. I won't name the university. But to see these young men and women, Catholic Christians, so faithful, so loving the Eucharist, that are make confession at this particular university. And this is not a Catholic university. This is a secular university. Lines of these young people making confession, seeking the truth. They're going to have a conference with 20,000 of these young kids, and they know their faith cold. Cold. They know more at the age of 20 and 21 and 22 than most adult Catholics that I have run into, including myself. It's awesome. And there's a lot of hope in that. And I said we'd get back to something else in the show, and I want to point this out, that what's happening now with all the scandal, for those that are devout Catholics, uptick in daily Mass, uptick in adoration, more people praying the rosary, more people trying to live the church's precepts. So they're getting stronger as the heat's turned up. And if we look at our church's history, this is how civilization, this is how the church, and this is how you and I, as men and women of God, and as a society, flourish and are saved. Because this has happened in every epoch, that these great saints that arise from the church, that Jesus brings up, these great men and women, they're the ones that lead us into new barriers. And we see this. And if Pope Benedict's prophecy comes true that the church will be smaller and stronger and holier, it's going to do great things. Because, you know, if we look at scriptural history, it's always been this remnant that's always done and changed things. I mentioned the bubonic plague. Look at what St. Catherine of Siena did and her witness and what she did to bring the church back. We look at St. Francis when Jesus talked to him from the crucifix, asking to build his church. And Francis thought, oh, he must mean the church where this crucifix is, San Damiano. But no, it was the church. And we look at what happened there. I mentioned the Dark Ages and how the monasteries being built up and those monks painstakingly writing down the culture of the Greeks and Romans, all these classics, and holding on to the threads of civilization that saves Western civilization, that shaped it. Many things that the media certainly doesn't want to portray, or history, modern history, revisionist history. But it's the truth. And we see through all these troubles and all these times that the church has always survived. And God, who is in charge of it, it's his mystical body, will come through. And we take confidence in that. And we take hope in that. Because that's the thing. All this with the scandal, and all the darkness, and all the negativity, remember, Christ is our hope. Christ is our hope. And not just at the end of time, not just in eternity, but here and now. Many, many good things are happening. I mentioned that young group of people, and they weren't the only ones. Apparently, at this university, they have many, many young people. And the young man told me, all of us think we have a vocation to either being a nun or priest. How awesome is that? And we see the young people, the young priests now being ordained. They're orthodox. They're speaking the truth. They're not whittling away anything or watering it down or bending to the secular thinking. And there's a great deal of hope in that. When we look at the World Youth Days, initiated by St. John Paul II, 3 million attending, just in that one in Rio. And you look at the University of Steubenville, and people like Justin Fatikin, you're amazing for, and the youth being caught up with that, the street evangelization that's going on. So don't give up. Things very well may be, and I certainly could be wrong, because I'm just a human being, a sinner, like everybody else. Things may be being stripped away by God to uncover a purity and a holiness and a goodness, and to let us examine ourselves and do penance, and to let us grow closer to him and trust in him. And it only takes a few. It only takes a few. And you, brother or sister, could be that one. You could be that one that have such an enormous impact on one life, 2 life, 100 lives, 1,000. Who knows? With the Holy Spirit, God knows us. We know this. He tells us in Scripture, nothing is impossible with God. And this will work out. And it very well may get much worse before it gets better. But it will get better. It will. And we're going to see good things come. We're going to see good things come. And if my generation, unfortunately, was the first that did not make it better for the generation that followed, I believe that this generation coming up, this youth, despite all the negativity, is going to do that. Because there are many young girls and boys out there that are striving to fall in love with Jesus, and they're falling in love with Jesus. And they're falling in love with our church. And they're sincere, and they're strong, and they're hopeful. And that's going to have a domino effect. Because they're seeking truth in a world that wants to eliminate it, or at the very least, cover up to mean anything you want. And these young people, they see right through it. You know, they can spot a phony a mile away. And they see the truth in Jesus, the hope and the joy of Jesus. So we are living in interesting times, to say the least. But do not despair and do not bottom out. Christ gets good from the worst imaginable scenario as sinners we present to him. He will draw good for our sake and bring us to him. And I'd like to close with those priests, those religious. Come to Mary. Come to Mary. consecrate yourselves to Mary. She will protect you with her mantle and bring you to Jesus, so that, as at Cana, you will do whatever he tells you. And there's a lesson in there for us, brothers and sisters. And with that, good night, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.